The sun melted into the horizon like butter on a hot skillet as Grace Evans stumbled down the dusty main street of Desdemona, Texas, her torn dress and bruised face turning heads that quickly looked away when she tried to meet their eyes. She knew what they were thinking, that she was just another saloon girl who had gotten what was coming to her, but they were wrong. And the truth burned inside her like wildfire in drought-stricken grass. Desdemona in 1876 was a town caught between its humble beginnings and its ambitious future, perched on the precipice of change as the railroad promised to bring prosperity to the small settlement built on cattle and cotton. The single street lined with wooden buildings baked under the Texas summer, businesses ranging from the general store to the blacksmith's forge to the two-story hotel that housed the only proper dining establishment for 20 miles. Grace's steps faltered as she approached the sheriff's office, her trembling hand reaching for the doorknob before she could lose her courage. Inside, Sheriff Wilson looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face impassive as she began to speak, the words tumbling from her lips like water from a broken dam. "It was him, Sheriff. Judge Harmon's son, Franklin. He attacked me when I was walking back from delivering the mending to Mrs. Pickens." Her voice cracked as she continued. "He dragged me behind the livery and the sheriff's expression didn't change as he leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his considerable weight. "Miss Evans, these are serious accusations against a respectable young man. Do you have any witnesses? Any proof?" "My word should be enough," Grace said, her chin rising despite the pain it caused her split lip. Sheriff Wilson's laugh was without humor. "Your word, the word of a seamstress who lives alone, against the son of the most powerful man in the county." He shook his head. "I'd advise you to forget what happened, Miss Evans. Some things are better left unsaid in a town like this." Grace felt the walls closing in around her. "So you won't help me?" "I'm helping you more than you know by telling you to let this go," the sheriff replied, turning his attention back to his paperwork. "Good day, Miss Evans." Grace stepped back into the harsh sunlight, despair settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected to be dismissed without even the pretense of an investigation. As she walked away from the sheriff's office, she felt the stares of the townspeople boring into her back, their whispers following her like shadows. She made it halfway down the street before her legs gave out, and she sank onto a wooden bench outside the general store, her face buried in her hands. That's when she heard the sound of spurs jingling, followed by the creak of leather as someone sat beside her. "Madam, are you all right?" Grace looked up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a face tanned by years under the open sky. The stranger was tall and lean, with a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. His dark hair curled slightly under the brim of his Stetson, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, white against his sun-darkened skin. "I'm fine," she lied, quickly wiping away her tears. The man's gaze took in her bruised face and torn dress, and his expression darkened. "You don't look fine to me, madam." "It doesn't matter what I look like," Grace said bitterly. "No one in this town cares anyway." The stranger studied her for a long moment. "My name's Zane Xavier," he said finally, extending his hand. "Just rode into town looking for work. I was hoping to find honest folk here." Despite herself, Grace took his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and a rough life. "Grace Evans. And if it's honest folk you're looking for, Mr. Xavier, you've come to the wrong place." "Call me Zane," he said, releasing her hand. "And I've found that honest folk are everywhere. They're just sometimes harder to find in some places than others." Grace couldn't help the small smile that touched her lips, though it faded quickly as she thought of what lay ahead of her. "Well, Zane, welcome to Desdemona." I'd show you around, but I'm afraid I'm not feeling very hospitable at the moment. Zane nodded, understanding in his eyes. No need to apologize. Is there someone I can fetch for you? Someone who might help? There's no one, Grace said, rising to her feet. But thank you for your concern. It's more than most have shown me today. As she turned to leave, Zane stood as well. Miss Evans, he called after her. Whatever happened to you, I'm sorry, and if there's anything I can do. Grace paused, looking back at him. For a moment, she considered telling this stranger everything, pouring out her heart to a man who seemed genuinely concerned. But the memory of the sheriff's dismissal was still too fresh. There's nothing anyone can do, Mr. Xavier. Not in this town. With those words, she continued down the street, her steps a little steadier now despite the weight she carried. Zane watched her go, his brow furrowed in thought. He hadn't come to Desdemona looking for trouble, but something about the woman's defeated posture and the raw pain in her eyes stirred something deep within him, a sense of justice that had been dormant for too long. With a sigh, he adjusted his hat and headed toward the saloon. If there was one place to learn the secrets of a town like Desdemona, it would be there, among the whiskey and the loose tongues it loosened. The Golden Spur Saloon was like 100 others Zane had seen in his travels, a long bar along one wall, scattered tables filled with men nursing drinks or playing cards, and a small stage where a tired-looking woman in a faded dress sang a mournful ballad to the uninterested crowd. Zane made his way to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and listened. It didn't take long for him to hear Grace's name spoken in hushed tones at a nearby table. Evans' woman's claiming young Franklin Harmon attacked her, one man said, shaking his head. She always was a troublemaker, another replied. Coming into town with no family, setting up that sewing shop like she's better than the rest of us. Judge won't stand for accusations against his boy, a third added. She'd best watch herself. Zane sipped his whiskey, keeping his expression neutral even as anger simmered beneath the surface. He'd seen this scenario play out in other towns, the powerful preying on the vulnerable, the community turning a blind eye to protect their own interests. It was the reason he'd left his last position, unable to stomach the corruption that had infiltrated the very system he'd sworn to uphold. As the evening wore on, Zane gathered more information. Grace Evans had come to Desdemona 2 years ago, a young woman alone in a world that wasn't kind to women without protection. She'd opened a small seamstress shop, keeping to herself but earning respect for her fine work and fair prices. Franklin Harmon, meanwhile, was the only son of Judge Harmon, a man who ruled the county with an iron fist, dispensing justice as he saw fit and crushing anyone who dared cross him. It was a story as old as time, and one that rarely ended well for someone in Grace's position. The next morning, Zane found himself outside Grace's small shop, hesitating before knocking on the door. A small sign in the window read "Closed," but he could see movement inside, the shadow of someone moving about. After a moment's consideration, he rapped his knuckles against the wooden frame. "Miss Evans, it's Zane Xavier from yesterday." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack and Grace's face appeared, the bruises now more pronounced against her pale skin. "Mr. Xavier," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What can I do for you?" "I was hoping we might talk," Zane said, removing his hat. "I heard some things in town that concerned me." Grace's expression closed off. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Xavier." "It's not pity I'm offering," Zane replied steadily. "It's help." For a long moment, Grace studied him, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, with a sigh, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, then, but I don't see what you could possibly do." The interior of the shop was neat and orderly, with bolts of fabric arranged by color along one wall and a work table in the center, strewn with patterns and half-finished garments. A small living area was visible through a doorway at the back, simple but comfortable. "Would you like some coffee?" Grace asked, gesturing toward a chair. "It's the least I can offer for your concern, though I still think it's misplaced." "Coffee would be fine, thank you," Zane said, taking a seat as Grace disappeared into the back room. When she returned with 2 steaming cups, Zane noticed that she moved carefully as if in pain. The sight fueled his determination. "Miss Evans," he began after taking a sip of the strong brew, "I heard what happened to you, or at least the town's version of it." Grace's hands tightened around her cup. "And what version is that?" "That you're accusing Judge Harmon's son of attacking you, and that no one believes you." A bitter laugh escaped Grace's lips. "That's about the sum of it, Mr. Xavier. Though you left out the part where I'm a troublemaking outsider who should know better than to speak against my betters." "I'd like to hear your version," Zane said quietly. Grace set her cup down with a clatter. "Why? What difference would it make? You're a stranger passing through town." "Even if you believed me, what could you do?" "I wasn't always a drifter, Miss Evans," Zane said, his voice low. "I used to be a lawman up in Wyoming territory. I know something about justice and injustice." Something flickered in Grace's eyes, a spark of hope quickly extinguished by doubt. "Ex-lawman or not, you're one man against the most powerful family in the county." "Sometimes one man is all it takes to start something," Zane replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I need to know the truth." Grace was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, with a deep breath, she began to speak. "I was walking home from delivering some mending to Mrs. Pickens on the edge of town. It was late afternoon, still daylight. Franklin Harmon rode up behind me on that big bay of his, asked if I wanted a ride back to town. When I declined, he got angry." Her voice faltered, but she pushed on. "He grabbed me, dragged me behind the livery where no one could see. He said it was time I learned my place, that a woman alone had no business turning down a man like him." She touched her bruised cheek unconsciously. "When I fought back, he hit me. Then he tore at my clothes." Zane's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to interrupt her flow of words. "I managed to grab a rock," Grace continued, her voice stronger now. "Hit him hard enough to stun him, then ran. I went straight to the sheriff, but—" She shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "You know how that turned out." "And no one saw anything?" Zane asked. "If they did, they're not saying," Grace replied. "Who would risk crossing the Harmons for someone like me?" Zane considered this, turning his hat in his hands. "What do you want, Miss Evans?" The question seemed to surprise her. "What do I want?" "Yes, do you want justice? Revenge, to leave town and start fresh somewhere else? What is it you're hoping for?" Grace's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "I want him to face consequences for what he did. I want people to know the truth. I want—" She paused, gathering herself. "I want to stay in the home I've made for myself without living in fear." Zane nodded, setting his hat on the table. "Then I'll help you get that." "How?" Grace asked, skepticism evident in her voice. "First, we need evidence," Zane said, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Then we need allies. Even in a town like this, there must be some who aren't under the Harmon's thumb. And finally, we need to force this into the open where it can't be ignored." Grace studied him, doubt warring with desperate hope in her eyes. "Why would you do this for a stranger? What's in it for you?" Zane's expression softened slightly. "Let's just say I've seen too many people like Franklin Harmon get away with too much. Maybe it's time someone stood up to them, even if it's just a drifter and a seamstress." A ghost of a smile touched Grace's lips. "You make it sound almost possible, Mr. Xavier." "Zane," he reminded her. "And it is possible, Grace. Difficult, dangerous even, but possible. For the first time since he'd met her, something like hope kindled in Grace's eyes. "Then I suppose we have work to do, Zane." The next days passed in a flurry of quiet activity as Zane and Grace began to build their case. Zane took a job at the livery, positioning himself to hear the town's gossip while establishing himself as just another drifter looking for honest work. Grace, meanwhile, continued her business as usual, though she kept her shop door locked and a loaded derringer within reach at all times. Their first breakthrough came unexpectedly, in the form of a young woman named Lily who worked at the hotel dining room. She came to Grace's shop under the pretense of having a dress mended, but once alone, she confessed that she had seen Franklin dragging Grace behind the livery. "I was afraid to say anything," Lily admitted, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Mr. Harmon, he's not a good man, Miss Evans, and the judge, he'd make sure I lost my job if I spoke against his son." "You're brave to come forward now," Grace said gently. Lily shook her head. "Not brave enough to say it in public, but I couldn't let you face this alone, not when I know the truth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One witness willing to admit, at least in private, that Grace's story had merit. Their second piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Thompson, the town's elderly physician, called Zane into his office one evening after hours. "Young man," he said without preamble, "I hear you've been asking questions about the Evans woman and Franklin Harmon." Zane tensed, ready for a confrontation, but the doctor waved him to a seat. "Relax, I'm not here to warn you off, quite the contrary." He pulled a small notebook from his desk drawer. "I treated Miss Evans the day after the incident. I recorded her injuries, bruising consistent with a physical assault, defensive wounds on her hands, torn clothing. All of it matches her account." "Why didn't you speak up when she went to the sheriff?" Zane asked, accepting the notebook. Dr. Thompson's aged face creased with shame. "Fear, Mr. Xavier. I've been in this town for 40 years, seen the Harmons rise to power. I told myself I was too old to fight that battle, that it wasn't my place." He sighed heavily. "But I can't sleep at night knowing I stood by while an innocent woman suffered. I may be a coward, but I'm still a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm, and my silence is causing harm." "Would you testify to what you've told me?" Zane asked, hope rising in his chest. The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If it comes to that, yes. I'm an old man, Mr. Xavier. What's the worst they can do to me?" With two potential witnesses and the doctor's notes, their case was growing stronger. But they needed more, something that couldn't be dismissed as the word of an old man, and a frightened hotel made against the son of the most powerful man in the county. That something arrived in the form of Franklin Harmon himself, who had taken to riding past Grace's shop several times a day, his presence a clear intimidation tactic. On the fourth day of this, Zane was inside discussing their next steps when Franklin dismounted and pounded on the door. "Come out, Evans," he shouted, his voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "We need to have a talk about these lies you're spreading." Grace paled, her hand automatically reaching for the derringer hidden in her pocket. Zane laid a gentle hand on her arm, shaking his head. "Let me handle this," he said softly. "Stay inside, but listen carefully. Try to remember everything he says." Before Grace could protest, Zane was at the door, opening it to face the angry young man outside. Franklin Harmon was everything Zane had expected: handsome in a harsh way, with expensive clothes and an air of entitlement that came from a lifetime of getting his way. His face showed surprise at seeing Zane instead of Grace, quickly replaced by contempt. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Name's Zane Xavier," Zane replied calmly. "I'm a friend of Miss Evans." Franklin's lip curled. "Friend, huh? Well, friend, you tell that lying bitch to keep her mouth shut about me if she knows what's good for her. She's lucky I didn't press charges for assaulting me with that rock." "Seems to me," Zane said, still maintaining his calm demeanor, "that if she hit you with a rock, she must have had a reason." "The reason is she's crazy," Franklin spat. "I offered her a ride. She turned me down, then came at me like a wildcat when I tried to be polite about it. She's lucky all she got was a slap to set her straight." Zane's eyes narrowed slightly at the admission. "So you did hit her?" Franklin realized his mistake a moment too late, his face flushing with anger. "That's not I didn't." He took a threatening step forward. "You're twisting my words, stranger. That's a dangerous game in this town." "Is that a threat, Mr. Harmon?" "It's a fact," Franklin said, his voice lowering. "My father owns this town, and no one's going to take the word of a drifter and a spinster against me. So do yourself a favor and move on before you get hurt." With that, he turned and mounted his horse, riding away with a final glare that promised trouble. Zane closed the door, turning to find Grace standing just inside the living area, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "He admitted it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He admitted hitting me." "Yes, he did," Zane agreed, a smile spreading across his face. "And he did it right here on your doorstep, where anyone passing by might have heard. But who would testify to that?" Grace asked, the hope in her voice tempered by practicality. Zane's smile widened. "How about Mr. Peterson from the general store? He was sweeping his porch across the street, looking this way the entire time. And Mrs. Gunderson was watering her window boxes next door. I'd wager both of them heard every word." For the first time since he'd met her, Grace laughed a sound of genuine relief and joy that transformed her face, making Zane realize just how beautiful she was beneath the fear and pain that had shadowed her features. "You planned this," she said, shaking her head in wonder. "You knew he'd come by again and wanted witnesses to hear him." "I hoped," Zane corrected. "Sometimes hope is all we have." Grace's expression sobered as she looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Who are you, Zane Xavier?" "Really?" Zane hesitated, then sighed. "I told you I was a lawman up north. What I didn't say was why I left." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of discomfort. "I arrested the mayor's son for attacking a young woman, much like Franklin attacked you. Had witnesses, evidence, everything needed for a conviction. But the mayor intervened, witnesses changed their stories, evidence disappeared, and suddenly I was the one facing charges of corruption and false arrest." "What happened?" Grace asked softly. "I was given a choice: resign and leave town with my name relatively intact, or face a trial where the outcome was already decided. I chose to leave." Zane's jaw tightened at the memory. The woman he attacked, she left too, couldn't bear to stay where justice had failed her so completely. Grace moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Zane." "Don't be," he replied, covering her hand with his own. "If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here now helping you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe this is my chance to make things right in some small way." The touch of her hand, warm and steady against his arm, stirred something in Zane that he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection that went beyond the shared purpose that had brought them together. But now wasn't the time for such feelings, not when they had so much at stake. Gently, he withdrew his hand. "We should speak to Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Gunderson, see if they'd be willing to come forward with what they heard." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Yes, of course. And then what?" "Then," Zane said, his determination renewed, "we take this to someone who can do something about it. Not the sheriff, he's clearly in the Harmon's pocket. But there must be a circuit judge, someone outside the Harmon's influence." "Judge Hamilton comes through every 6 weeks, Grace said, a frown creasing her brow. but he's not due for another month at least. We can't wait that long, Zane replied, thinking quickly. Franklin's already escalating his intimidation. Next time he might do more than make threats. He paced the small room, considering their options. We need to force this into the open now while we have momentum. How do we do that? Grace asked. Zane stopped pacing, a plan forming in his mind. We make it a public matter. Tomorrow's Sunday, everyone in town will be at church. After the service, we confront the judge and Franklin in front of the entire congregation. Grace's eyes widened. That's bold. It's risky, Zane acknowledged. But if we do it privately, they can deny everything, make it your word against Franklin's again. This way, the whole town witnesses it. They may not all support you, but they won't be able to pretend it didn't happen. Grace was quiet for a long moment, weighing the danger against the possibility of justice. Finally, she nodded, her decision made. All right, tomorrow then. That night, as Zane returned to his rented room above the livery, he couldn't help but think about Grace, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, her determination to stand up for herself, despite the cost. In the short time he'd known her, she had impressed him in ways few people ever had. And if he was honest with himself, there was more to his feelings than mere admiration. There was a pull toward her, a connection that seemed to strengthen with each passing day. But he pushed those thoughts aside. First justice, then. Well, then they would see what might be possible between a drifter with a troubled past and a seamstress fighting for her dignity. Sunday dawned bright and clear, the Texas sun already promising another scorching day as the townspeople of Desdemona made their way to the small white church on the edge of town. Zane, dressed in his best clothes, clean, if somewhat worn, waited outside Grace's shop, his stomach tight with anticipation. When she emerged, he was struck anew by her quiet beauty. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her honey blonde hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. The bruises on her face had faded somewhat, though they were still visible against her fair skin. "You look lovely," Zane said, offering his arm. Grace blushed slightly, taking his arm with a small smile. "Thank you. I thought about hiding away, but I won't give them the satisfaction of making me ashamed." "Good," Zane replied as they began walking toward the church. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." They had arranged to meet Dr. Thompson, Mr. Peterson, and Mrs. Gunderson after the service, all three having agreed to speak up if necessary. Lily from the hotel had been more reluctant, fearful of losing her position, but had finally promised to confirm what she had seen if directly asked. The church was nearly full when they arrived, and a hush fell over the congregation as they entered. Zane felt the weight of dozens of stares as he guided Grace to a pew near the back, murmurs following in their wake. Judge Harmon and his family occupied the front pew, as befitted their status in the community. Franklin sat beside his father, his posture rigid and proud, seemingly unconcerned by the controversy swirling around him. The service passed in a blur for Zane, his mind focused on what was to come rather than Reverend Miller's sermon on truth and justice, and irony not lost on him. Beside him, Grace sat with her head held high, though he could feel the tension in her body where her arm pressed against his. As the final hymn ended and people began to file out, Zane gave Grace's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Ready?" She took a deep breath, then nodded. "Ready." They waited until the Harmons had exited the church, then followed them out into the churchyard where people were gathered in small groups, exchanging the usual Sunday pleasantries. Zane and Grace moved purposefully toward the judge and his family, their approach noted by those nearby, who fell silent in anticipation. "Judge Harmon," Zane called, his voice carrying across the yard. I'd like a word with you and your son." The judge turned, his face a mask of polite inquiry that did not quite hide his annoyance. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir." "My name is Zane Xavier," Zane replied, coming to a stop a few feet from the older man. "I'm here on behalf of Miss Grace Evans, who has a serious complaint against your son." The murmurs around them grew louder as people moved closer, eager to witness the confrontation. Franklin's face darkened with anger, while his father maintained his air of affronted dignity. "Whatever Miss Evans has to say, she can say through proper channels," Judge Harmon said dismissively. "This is hardly the place for such matters." "I disagree," Zane countered. "When those proper channels refuse to hear her, what choice does she have but to speak where she can be heard?" The judge's facade of civility slipped slightly. "Are you accusing our sheriff of negligence, Mr. Xavier?" "I'm stating a fact," Zane said calmly. "Miss Evans reported an assault to Sheriff Wilson, who dismissed her without investigation. Now she's seeking justice elsewhere." Franklin stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. She's lying, and you know it, stranger. No one's going to take her word over mine." "That's where you're wrong," Zane replied. "Dr. Thompson examined Miss Evans after the attack and documented her injuries." He gestured to the elderly doctor, who stepped forward from the crowd, his expression solemn. "Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Gunderson heard you admit to hitting her just yesterday when you threatened her at her shop." The onlookers gasped at this, eyes darting between the accused and the accusers. Judge Harmon's face hardened as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. "These are serious allegations," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you persist in spreading such slander about my son, there will be consequences." "The only consequence should be justice," Grace spoke up, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Your son attacked me, Judge Harmon. He dragged me behind the livery, hit me, and tried to force himself on me. I managed to fight him off, but that doesn't change what he did or what he tried to do." Franklin lunged forward suddenly, his control snapping. "You lying bitch! You came onto me, and when I turned you down, you made up this whole story to get back at me." Zane stepped between them, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "That's not what you said yesterday, Franklin. Yesterday you admitted to hitting her, said she was lucky that's all she got." "I didn't. You can't prove," Franklin sputtered, looking to his father for support. Judge Harmon placed a restraining hand on his son's arm, his gaze cold as he surveyed the growing crowd. "This is not the place for such discussions. If Miss Evans wishes to make formal charges, she can do so through the proper legal channels." "The proper legal channels in this town seem to lead nowhere when it comes to the Harmon family," Zane responded, his voice carrying to the assembled townspeople. "That's why we're bringing this to you directly, Judge. As a man sworn to uphold the law, will you see that justice is done even when the accused is your own son?" The challenge hung in the air, and for a moment, Zane thought the judge might actually consider it. But then the older man's face hardened, and he drew himself up to his full height. "I will not dignify these accusations with a response," he declared. "Come, Franklin, we're leaving." As they turned to go, a new voice spoke up from the crowd. "I saw it." Lily, the young hotel worker, stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I was bringing linens to the laundry behind the hotel when I saw Mr. Harmon dragging Miss Evans behind the livery. She was fighting him, and he hit her hard enough that she fell. I was scared, so I hid, but I saw it happen." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Franklin whirled to face the new accuser. "You're lying too. Father, are you going to let these people slander me like this?" But Judge Harmon was looking around at the faces of his neighbors and constituents. Noting the doubt that had begun to replace the automatic deference, he was accustomed to. His political instincts told him that the tide was turning, that blindly defending his son might cost him more than he was willing to pay. "There will be an investigation," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A proper one, conducted by who?" Zane interrupted. "Sheriff Wilson, who already dismissed Miss Evans without even looking into her claims. Or perhaps by yourself, Judge. Neither seems likely to be impartial." "What do you suggest then, Mr. Xavier?" the judge asked, sarcasm heavy in his tone. "That we hold an impromptu trial here in the churchyard. I suggest," Zane said evenly, "that you send for Judge Hamilton immediately. Let him preside over a formal hearing, with witnesses and evidence presented before the entire town. If your son is innocent, as you claim, surely he has nothing to fear from such a proceeding." The challenge was clear, and Judge Harmon knew it. To refuse would be tantamount to admitting his son's guilt, or at least acknowledging that he didn't believe Franklin could withstand scrutiny. "Fine," he said after a tense moment. "Send for Judge Hamilton. We'll have your hearing, Mr. Xavier, and when my son is exonerated, you'll answer for this circus you've created." "That seems fair," Zane agreed, extending his hand to seal the agreement. Judge Harmon ignored the offered hand, turning on his heel and marching away, a subdued Franklin in tow. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over what they had witnessed and what was to come. Grace turned to Zane, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "What have we done?" Zane took her hands in his, squeezing gently. "We've started something that can't be stopped, Grace. For better or worse, the truth is going to come out now. And if it's for worse," she asked softly, "if Judge Hamilton sides with the Harmons, if people still don't believe me." "Then at least you'll know you fought," Zane replied, his gaze steady on hers. "And you won't have fought alone." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that went beyond their immediate situation. For a moment, it seemed as if Zane might say more, might give voice to the feelings that had been growing inside him. But the moment passed as others approached to offer their support or simply satisfy their curiosity about what would happen next. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. A rider was dispatched to find Judge Hamilton and bring him to Desdemona for the hearing. The town buzzed with speculation, sides were taken, and tensions ran high. Zane stayed close to Grace, concerned that Franklin or his supporters might try to intimidate her or worse. On the evening before Judge Hamilton was expected to arrive, Grace invited Zane to dinner at her small home behind the shop. She had prepared a simple meal: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, but to Zane, who had subsisted on saloon fare for weeks, it was a feast. "This is wonderful," he said, savoring a bite of tender chicken. "I'd almost forgotten what a home-cooked meal tastes like." Grace smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "It's the least I can do after all you've done for me." "I haven't done anything yet," Zane reminded her. "The real test comes tomorrow." "You've done more than you know," Grace said softly, setting down her fork. "Before you came, I was alone. Not just in fighting Franklin, but in everything. This town has never fully accepted me, never made me feel like I belonged. Until you." Zane felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the food spread through him at her words. "I haven't exactly been made welcome here either," he said with a small smile. "Maybe that's why we understand each other," Grace suggested. "We both know what it's like to be outsiders." "Maybe," Zane agreed, his eyes holding hers across the table. "Or maybe there's more to it than that." A blush crept into Grace's cheeks as she held his gaze. "Maybe there is," she acknowledged, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Grace broke it by rising to clear the dishes. Zane helped, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence, the back of his hand occasionally brushing against hers in a way that sent warmth coursing through him. As the evening drew to a close and Zane prepared to leave, Grace caught his hand at the door. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said earnestly, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the one bright spot in all of this. You gave me hope when I had none, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Zane raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "The feeling is mutual, Grace Evans. More than you know." He left her standing in the doorway, her face softly illuminated by the lamplight behind her, and walked back to his room above the livery with a lightness in his step that belied the gravity of what awaited them the following day. Judge Hamilton arrived just before noon, a stern-faced man with a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect throughout the territory. The town hall was hastily prepared for the hearing, benches arranged to accommodate as many spectators as possible, a table set up at the front for the judge. By 1 o'clock, the hall was packed to capacity, with more people crowded outside the open windows, straining to hear. Judge Harmon sat at one table with Franklin and a lawyer brought in from the next county. At the other table sat Grace, with Zane beside her not as legal counsel, but as moral support. Judge Hamilton called the room to order, his voice cutting through the buzz of conversation. "This is not a formal trial," he announced, surveying the crowded room with a practiced eye. "It is a hearing to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to warrant charges being filed against Franklin Harmon for the alleged assault on Miss Grace Evans. I will hear from both sides, as well as any witnesses who wish to speak. I expect civility and respect from everyone present." He gestured to Grace first. "Miss Evans, please tell us your account of the events in question." Grace rose, her face pale but composed as she recounted the attack in clear, steady terms. She described Franklin's initial approach, his anger at her refusal, the struggle behind the livery, and her escape after striking him with a rock. Throughout her testimony, she maintained eye contact with Judge Hamilton, her dignity intact despite the painful subject matter. When she finished, the judge turned to Dr. Thompson. "Doctor, you examined Miss Evans after the alleged attack. What did you observe?" The elderly physician described Grace's injuries in clinical detail: the bruising on her face and arms, the defensive wounds on her hands, the torn clothing. "In my professional opinion," he concluded, "her injuries were consistent with the type of assault she described." Next came Lily, trembling but determined as she told of seeing Franklin drag Grace behind the livery, of hearing Grace's cries and seeing her escape, disheveled and distraught. Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Gunderson followed, both testifying to Franklin's threatening behavior at Grace's shop and his admission to having hit her. When it was Franklin's turn, he took the stand with an air of injured innocence, denying everything and painting Grace as a spurned woman seeking revenge. "She's been after me for months," he claimed, his handsome face arranged in an expression of bewildered hurt. "When I made it clear I wasn't interested, she became unstable, started making up stories, trying to ruin my reputation." "And how do you explain the witnesses who saw you drag Miss Evans behind the livery?" Judge Hamilton asked, his expression neutral. Franklin faltered slightly. "They're mistaken. It was dark, and Miss Lily said it was late afternoon, still daylight," the judge interrupted. "Then she's lying." Franklin snapped, his composure cracking. "They're all lying, protecting her because she's a woman. It's not fair." Judge Hamilton's eyebrows rose at the outburst. "And Dr. Thompson, is he lying about Miss Evans's injuries?" "She probably did that to herself," Franklin muttered, not meeting the judge's eyes. "Or got some drifter to do it to frame me." "That's a serious accusation," Judge Hamilton noted. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" Franklin looked to his father, who remained stonily silent, then to his lawyer, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. "No," he finally admitted, "but it's more likely than what she's claiming." The questioning continued for another hour, with Judge Hamilton methodically probing each witness's story, looking for inconsistencies or contradictions. Franklin grew increasingly agitated under the scrutiny, while Grace remained composed, answering each question thoughtfully. Finally, Judge Hamilton called Zane to speak. "Mr. Xavier, you're relatively new to town, I understand. How did you become involved in this matter?" Zane stood, conscious of the weight of every eye in the room upon him. "I met Miss Evans the day after the attack, when she was visibly injured and distressed. After hearing her story and the sheriff's refusal to investigate, I offered to help her find justice." "And what is your interest in this case, Mr. Xavier?" the judge asked, his gaze penetrating. "Why involve yourself in a local dispute when you're just passing through?" Zane hesitated, aware that his answer could influence how the judge and the townspeople viewed the case. He could give the expected answer, speak of justice and moral duty, or he could tell the truth, plain and simple. He chose the truth. "I believe Miss Evans," he said simply. "I believe her because when I look at her, I see a woman of integrity and courage. I believe her because her story has remained consistent from the beginning, while Mr. Harmon's has shifted with each telling. I believe her because the evidence supports her account, and because I've seen firsthand how power can corrupt justice when no one is willing to stand against it." He paused, his gaze finding Grace's in the crowd, drawing strength from the trust he saw there. "And I believe her because I've come to care deeply for her in the short time I've known her. I couldn't stand by and watch her suffer alone, not when I had the ability to help." A murmur ran through the crowd at this admission, and Grace's eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks. Judge Hamilton studied Zane for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied by his honesty. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. You may be seated." As Zane returned to his place beside Grace, he felt her hand slip into his under the table, a silent acknowledgement of his words. He squeezed her fingers gently, hoping she understood that every word had been true. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to him. "Having heard from all parties involved, I am ready to render a decision." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air as the judge looked solemnly around at the assembled faces. In cases such as these, where there are no impartial eyewitnesses to the actual assault, we must rely on circumstantial evidence and the credibility of those involved. Miss Evans has presented a consistent account, supported by physical evidence and multiple witnesses who corroborate key elements of her story. Mr. Harmon, on the other hand, has offered denials without explanation for the evidence against him, and has demonstrated behavior consistent with someone attempting to intimidate a witness. He turned to face Franklin directly. "Based on the testimony presented here today, I find that there is sufficient evidence to warrant formal charges of assault against Franklin Harmon." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by a buzz of excited conversation. Franklin jumped to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous. Father, are you going to let this happen?" Judge Harmon remained seated, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the room. He had seen which way the wind was blowing, had noted the shifting attitudes of the townspeople as the evidence mounted against his son. A lifetime in politics had taught him when to fight and when to cut his losses. "The judge has made his ruling," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We will abide by it." But Franklin began, only to be silenced by his father's raised hand. "Enough, Franklin. You've done enough damage." He turned to Judge Hamilton. "What happens now? Your son will be taken into custody to await trial, Judge Hamilton replied. Given the seriousness of the charges and the evidence of intimidation, I don't believe bail is appropriate in this case. As Sheriff Wilson reluctantly came forward to take Franklin into custody, Judge Harmon approached Grace and Zane, his face a careful mask of dignity. "Miss Evans," he said stiffly, "it appears I owe you an apology. I was blinded by paternal loyalty. It was never my intention to see justice denied." Grace regarded him steadily, neither accepting nor rejecting his words. "I understand loving your son, Judge Harmon, but love shouldn't excuse harm done to others." The judge inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the rebuke. Then he turned to Zane, his expression hardening. "Mr. Xavier, I won't pretend to be pleased with your role in this matter, but I will say that you've shown more backbone than many in this town, myself included. For that, you have my reluctant respect." With that, he followed his son and the sheriff out of the town hall, his shoulders straight despite the blow to his family's reputation and his own standing in the community. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopped to speak to Grace, offering support or apologies for not believing her earlier. Through it all, Zane remained at her side, his presence a steady anchor as she navigated this sudden shift in the town's perception of her. When they finally stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street, Grace turned to Zane, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and vindication. "We did it," she said softly. "I can hardly believe it." "You did it," Zane corrected her, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "All I did was help you be heard." Grace shook her head, stepping closer to him. "No, Zane, what you did was believe me when no one else would. What you did was stand beside me when everyone else stepped away. What you did," her voice faltered slightly, "what you did was make me feel less alone in the world." Zane's heart swelled at her words, and before he could think better of it, he leaned down and kissed her gently, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. Grace responded immediately, melting into his embrace as if she had been waiting for this moment as long as he had. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and a little dazed, Zane pressed his forehead to hers. "I meant what I said in there, Grace. I care for you more than I thought possible in such a short time." "I feel the same," Grace admitted, her smile radiant despite the tears that still threatened to spill. "It's as if you were sent here just when I needed you most." "Maybe I was," Zane mused, taking her hand as they began walking toward her shop. "Or maybe we found each other because we were both looking for something we didn't even know we needed." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, fitting perfectly against him as they walked. "What happens now?" "With Franklin, I mean. He'll stand trial," Zane said. "With the evidence we've gathered and Judge Hamilton overseeing the case, I'd say a conviction is likely." "And after that," Grace asked, her voice hesitant, "what happens with us?" Zane stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "That depends on what you want, Grace. I came to Desdemona with no plans to stay, no roots to put down. But now—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Now I find myself thinking of reasons to stay, one reason in particular." Grace's eyes softened as she understood his meaning. "And if I asked you to stay, to see if what's between us could grow into something lasting?" "Then I'd stay," Zane said simply. "I'd stay, and I'd count myself the luckiest man in Texas to have found you." Grace's answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and possibility, there on the main street of Desdemona for all to see. And for the first time since she had arrived in this town, Grace felt truly at home. In the weeks that followed, Desdemona gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though the town was forever changed by what had transpired. Franklin Harmon was tried and convicted of assault, sentenced to 2 years in the state prison. Judge Harmon, his influence diminished but not destroyed, withdrew from public life for a time, focusing on his legal practice rather than politics. As for Grace and Zane, they took their time getting to know each other properly, no longer bound by the urgency of seeking justice, but free to explore the deep connection that had formed between them under such extraordinary circumstances. Zane found work as a deputy under the newly elected Sheriff Wilson, having resigned in the wake of the scandal, while Grace's seamstress business flourished, her standing in the community stronger than ever. They built a life together day by day, their relationship deepening with each sunrise and sunset shared. 6 months after the trial, on a crisp autumn evening with the stars shining like diamonds above the Texas plains, Zane asked Grace to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the small house they had purchased together on the edge of town, watching the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple. "I never thought I'd find a place to belong again," Zane said, taking her hand in his. "After what happened up north, I figured I'd spend my life drifting from town to town, never putting down roots. But then I met you, and everything changed. You gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build something lasting." Grace's eyes shimmered in the fading light as he dropped to one knee before her, a simple gold band held between his fingers. "Grace Evans, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me here in this town that's finally become home to both of us?" "Yes," Grace whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks as she pulled him to his feet and into her arms. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married the following spring in the same church where they had first confronted the Harmons. The building filled to capacity with townspeople who had come to respect and admire the couple who had stood for justice when others would have looked away. Dr. Thompson gave the bride away. Lily served as maid of honor, and even Judge Hamilton returned to Desdemona to perform the ceremony, his stern face softened by a rare smile as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled guests, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Zane and Grace Xavier." The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, a joyous affirmation of the community's acceptance and the couple's place within it. As they danced under lantern light in the town square, Grace leaned close to whisper in her new husband's ear, "You ever think about how strangely our story began, how unlikely it all was?" Zane pulled back to look into her eyes, his own filled with love and wonder. "Every day. But then I remind myself that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings." "Not an ending," Grace corrected him with a smile. "A beginning." And she was right. Their wedding day was just the beginning of a life built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and a love that had been forged in adversity but would flourish in peace. In time, they welcomed children, a son named Thomas, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit, and twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth, who inherited their father's determination and their mother's quiet strength. Their home became a haven not only for their growing family, but for others in need, Grace and Zane never forgetting what it felt like to stand alone against injustice. Years passed, and Desdemona grew alongside the Xavier family. The railroad came, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Zane eventually became sheriff, his reputation for fairness and integrity making him a natural choice when the position opened. Grace expanded her seamstress shop into a proper clothing store, employing several young women from the area, and teaching them not only about fabric and stitching but about standing up for themselves in a world that didn't always make it easy. On their 20th anniversary, they returned to the bench outside the general store where they had first met. The store was now owned by their oldest friend in town, Mr. Peterson, who had expanded it to include a post office and small cafe. "Hard to believe it's been 20 years, Grace mused, her hand resting comfortably in Zane's. Her blonde hair was now threaded with silver, laugh lines at the corners of her eyes testifying to a life well lived. "Hardest to believe is how lucky I was to find you," Zane replied, bringing her hand to his lips. At 50, he was as handsome as ever to Grace's eyes, the years having added dignity to his bearing and wisdom to his gaze. "One chance meeting on a terrible day, and my whole life changed." "Our whole lives changed," Grace corrected him with a smile. "And not just ours. Think of all the ripples from that one moment, how different Desdemona is now, how different our children's lives will be because of what we fought for." Zane nodded, looking out at the town that had become so dear to them both. "I'm proud of what we built here, Grace. Not just our family or our businesses, but the example we set. The proof that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when you're afraid, is always worth it in the end." "It was worth it from the first moment," Grace said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder just as she had done all those years ago, walking away from the trial that had changed everything. "From the very first moment you believed me." As the sun set on another day in Desdemona, Texas, Zane and Grace Xavier sat together on that bench, surrounded by the life they had created from the unlikeliest of beginnings, a testament to the power of truth, the strength of love, and the enduring belief that justice, though sometimes slow in coming, would always find its way to those with the courage to stand and be counted.